welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and our guest today is...
Hi, I'm Sara Flannery Murphy. I'm the author of Girl One.
And Girl One it's been described as so many different things. All of them were reasons for me to immediately want the galley. I saw like Orphan Black meets Margaret Atwood with a little bit of Stranger Things in there. And then it's set in the 90s. And I'm just like, check, all the things I want to read. So please talk a little bit about this book and where the idea for it came from.
Yeah, of course. So this book is an alternate timeline. In 1971, this very controversial scientist was able to induce parthenogenesis, more colloquially known as virgin birth, basically meaning that the egg fertilized by itself without sperm or male DNA. And he was able to induce virgin birth in 9 women, which created a firestorm of controversy, and people were threatened by the existence of these 9 baby girls who had no biological, no genetic father. In 1977, a tragedy occurred, and this group of women broke apart. And we pick back up in the 90s when Josephine Morrow, also known as Girl One, because she is the oldest of these 9 girls, realizes that her mother is missing under bizarre circumstances, sets out to track her down, and in the process ends up reconnecting with the other women who were born of this strange experiment, which reveals to her all these weird, dark secrets that she did not know about her own already very strange origin story. I came up with the idea a very long time ago, before my first book came out, but I just didn't know how to approach it for a really long time. I was taking a course during my MFA program, which had nothing to do with writing. Actually, it was the history of the body, which just covered like fashion, diet, and of course, reproduction, all throughout history, and how our own understanding of our bodies and other people's bodies has changed. And the section on reproduction was incredibly fascinating to me because it helped me understand that we haven't always had this pretty comprehensive understanding of exactly what goes into conception. I realized that I was a little bit spoiled by just knowing a basic idea of how babies are made by the time I was in, first or second grade, and that thousands upon thousands of years ago, even incredibly educated people wouldn't have that same knowledge. They just frankly, didn't have the technology, the awareness to be able to see it on such an intimate level to understand exactly what was going on, which led to a lot of strange theories about what exactly was going on. And I was struck by the fact that some people came to it less with the idea of figuring out reproduction and more with the idea of always making sure that the father was the one who was the most important part of this process, because I think it would have been pretty disruptive to admit even that like the mother, the person with the uterus, the person giving birth, was such an important part of this process. So many theories put the father right at the center, including saying that the father was the one who gave the child the soul. And I ran across this theory that if a woman thought past her station, I guess, or kind of had too many wild, unruly, independent thoughts of her own, she could self-impregnate, but that child without the soul given to it by the father would not be human, since the father is a necessary component of humanity according to this. And my brain instantly just took that and ran with it and thought, well, that would be a really interesting origin story. And originally, I had thought more along the lines of monsters. And over time, as I just mulled over this idea, and it was on my back burner for many years, it evolved more and more into a sort of superhero origin story in a way. I still tried to play around with some monster tropes, but it definitely ended up being more of a sci-fi story. So it had a pretty long evolution. It was a tricky book to approach, and I'm still it still feels very surreal, and I'm very grateful that it actually exists in the world now as a book that other people can pick up and read. It's been a long time.
So the book was really well balanced between sort of going back to some of Josephine's memories, a little bit of her collecting the other girls and picking up snippets of what was going on with them, and also just some other characters that may or may not be 100% reliable as to who they are, and what their interest in the story of the Homestead Girls actually was. I liked the way that the history of the homestead was described, because I felt very much like it could be these stories I was reading in these old magazines. As a child of the 90s myself, I had parents who were younger in like the 60s and 70s, and I remember just being intrigued by the Life magazines of that time and just these stories. And it all felt very, very real, which is good, because in alternate history books, if it doesn't have that real tactile connection, if you can't like feel it and smell it, you're going to drop your ability to suspend disbelief. This was not like that at all. And you wove in some real science about animals that do reproduce through parthenogenesis. I was 100% unaware of these lizards that come up in the story.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really fascinating to research parthenogenesis a little bit. And now I'm very lucky, because there are still stories where like snakes reproduce in captivity via parthenogenesis. And now I feel like everybody will send those stories to me, which is amazing, because I always wanted to be like the go-to person for snakes giving birth in captivity. Yeah, I'm glad that you said that about how it felt grounded in reality. That was really what I was trying to do with the excerpts that I wove in, because I wanted to give a glimpse into what Josie would have understood of her own origin story, because so much of this novel at the beginning is about Josie being both fascinated by her own origin and also not really having as much access to it as she would want, because she was only 6 years old when this fire occurred, and she kind of jumped immediately into a sort of approximation of a normal life that her mother Margaret was trying to offer to her for her own safety and protection. So I figured Josie would have pieced together her own origin story, the history, through like glimpses of her own story on TV late at night, or going to the local library and looking through archives and trying to find pieces that would illuminate these aspects of it. And I did find a lot of real stories that seemed to have a kind of parallel to this story that I was telling, like Louise Brown, who was born in 1978. and was the first, she was the result of the first successful IVF procedure, which at the time was incredibly groundbreaking, to the point where it kind of unsettled people, and it was like, what, like, a little over 40 years ago now. And now it's incredibly commonplace. But back then, it was so startling to people that there really were like tabloid stories about Louise Brown having telekinesis and like throwing baby toys around the room, because people just felt like, oh, she was born in such a strange way. How could she be just like a human like the rest of us? She must have something a little bit different about her, or maybe even supernatural. So being able to read pieces like that tabloid piece, it helped me think more carefully about what people might really have said about the homestead. Because I imagine that if there really had been a commune where 9 women gave birth without genetic fathers, that would be really, really disruptive and would probably create quite a few think pieces that were not flattering.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. So, because on one hand, these women have agency because they didn't need a man to reproduce. But on the other hand, you have the Dr. Joseph, who Josephine is named after, who was, he was credited for pretty much everything. And Josie herself seems to she reveres him as a father figure, and she has a complicated relationship with her mother, but and maybe that's because he's gone by the beginning of the story. He's been dead for a while, but he's just this larger than life father figure in the story. When you went about having Josie visit all of the other girls, was it difficult to think of them distinctly? Like, did you sort of have a chart as to, what their personalities would be, what their feelings on their own origins would be?
Yeah, I did try to use each of the mother-daughter pairs to illustrate how this might have affected them a little bit differently. The Clarksons, Deb and Bonnie, they had kind of continued using it as a way to have a little bit of a platform or to have some sway in the world, but they were very, very closed off to the idea that it might have made them different, or at least Deb was. And so she presents this very, very sanitized, kind of goofy version of what happened to the world, which I think that Josie comes to see Deb with more sympathy over time as she realizes like the dangers and why Deb might want to be cautious and careful and figure, I may as well get something out of this. Kate was one of my favorites to write because I feel like she has perhaps one of the healthiest attitudes towards what happened. She's very, very matter of fact about it, and she doesn't try to hide it. She's not ashamed of it. She acknowledges that she came from this strange origin story, but she doesn't romanticize it. And she's able to weave it into her own identity in a really, really, I think, healthy, self-actualized way that over the course of the novel, Josie begins to appreciate more and more. So she was, probably the most fun character to write. And then I have, Patricia and Isabel, who are kind of the inverse of Deb and Bonnie because they still are very fixated on the idea that it could have made Isabel a little more than human, a little special, and are still clinging to that in a certain way. So I did try to use each of the different destinations, each of the different women, to kind of explore, like, if you really had been born in this very strange, disruptive way, and then it kind of ended in a certain way, but it's always going to be like a long shadow over your life, how would you think about yourself? How would you form your identity separately as like a person inside of this huge, strange thing about you?
The setting is the 90s. Are you a child of the 90s yourself?
I am, yeah. Well, I was born in 84. So I was kind of growing up during the stretch of the 90s. I guess I was like a teenager when it ended. I think I turned 16. Yeah, that would make sense. I turned 16 in the year 2000. Um, so yeah, I was a child of the 90s. I was homeschooled and I was a little bit sheltered, like to put it mildly. So I always feel as if I have a less of an understanding of my specific time and place than other people. Or I guess I just have like I have a more like not unique, but a slightly different understanding just because I wasn't able to like go to school and be surrounded by a peer group. It was like I was happening, like my life was happening in a way that was a little bit separate and adjacent to like the larger culture and the larger society. But at the same time, I still do feel pretty connected to the 90s. And I did try to draw on my own memories of it a little bit, even though Josie is like 20, she's in her 20s at the time when I would have been, a little like 10-year-old. So we are living like slightly different lives, but I was able to draw on some of my own memories and some of my own like expertise regarding the 90s, which helped.
I think a lot of things recently have been set in the 90s. And as someone who was, I'm like sort of in between you and Josie. I was born in 79. But there's something interesting about that time period, aside from the fact that I think everybody who grows up in a certain time period considers their youth particularly interesting.
Yeah.
But that was the time period right before everybody was connected to everything.
Yeah.
Cell phones were still very scarce. If you were lucky and you were a teenager, like you had a beeper that, then you'd have to go running to find a payphone to call somebody. Or you were like looked at with suspicion because you had a beeper, because there were all sorts of standards as to who was supposed to have a beeper, certainly not teenage kids. And the internet was not really something that everybody was keyed into until about 97. Like 96, 97 was when everybody was getting those little AOL discs, and your time, like you got like a certain amount of free hours, and then you were charged a lot of money to use it. And also it was on your phone line. So it's not like now where if something was to happen, you could really just sit there, research it within 15 minutes and know everything about it. So it's funny to me because there's a lot of nostalgia that I have about that time period, but I also tend to gravitate towards stories in that time period because there was dangers to not being able to be connected all the time, but there were also freedoms to it.
Oh yeah, it's interesting to think about it from a plot perspective too, because it changes your plot so much depending on that little, that little gap between like the mid 90s and maybe like as early as the late 90s or the early aughts. Like people were suddenly able to access so much more information, which is, from a writer's perspective, that actually is pretty convenient, but it can take some of the suspense out of a story, and it can even make it difficult to tell a story the way you want to, because if Josie had been able to just like go online and use tools to look up these other mothers and daughters, if she had been able to find out more about her own past, even like I feel like you can, maybe if she'd been finding all this out in like the 2010s, the 2020s, there probably would have just been so much more information available, and she probably could have found out a lot more about her origin story, her background, just through that. I mean, much less even being able to look up the other mothers, daughters to connect with them. She might not have needed to quite as much. So yeah, set in 1994, like Josie's timeline is 1994. It really felt like one of the last times that she could have gone on this very specific road trip and used like road maps and stopped at gas stations to use like the phone booths. And I had a lot of fun with that. It felt like not like old fashioned at all, but it felt really satisfying to be able to write something that wasn't relying on phones. As much as like I'm sure I will write. I mean, I'm writing a story right now that has a timeline set in like 2015, and it's nice to be able to use phones once you kind of work them into the story. But I definitely had a lot of fun with writing Girl One and being able to use the 90s to support her exact kind of journey.
Is there going to be any more stories about the girls?
Maybe one day. I would love to. Yeah, I think that there could be something really fun about returning to them, especially if I jumped ahead, because without being too spoilery, we sort of leave them on a very big cusp. And I think that if we hopped ahead in time like 15, 20 years, it would be really interesting to see how this had impacted the world a little bit more, and what Josie had done with herself, how she had figured out how to balance her own identity with the identity of somebody that she's admired and looked up to for a very long time, and built herself around, and then found out these really gutting things about. I would love to see what Kate would do in the future as well, because I'm sure that she would, continue to be amazing. So I would be totally open to that. Right now I'm working on a standalone book. And I feel like the way my brain works, I'm a little bit restless. Like I have a lot of ideas. I'm unfortunately a very slow writer. Well, not very slow. I'm probably like medium. It's hard to say.
Possessions. When did the Possessions come out? I'm just like, now I'm trying to remember when that one came out.
That one came out in 2017.
Okay.
So, and I didn't start writing Girl One until, I think it was probably the fall after it came out. It came out in February. Because having a debut novel come out is like a very emotionally intense process. And I just could not like sit down in front of this screen and produce the work I needed to. I had to kind of work through the wildness of having my book out in the world and having so many people say things about it, and just refined my own sort of voice or confidence in what I wanted to say. So it really didn't take that long. I know I shouldn't compare myself to other writers. I do sometimes slip out of that and feel a lot of envy for the writers who are able to draft a book in like 8 weeks and produce a book in like a year. But
I know, there's so many writers who are like, oh yeah, no, this took me a few weeks to write, and now it's being published, and that's what's happening with the next one. And they're good books. And I'm like, whoa, there's no way. I can't imagine doing that. But it's also nice to hear from authors who do take their time, because I think it does put less pressure on prospective authors to know that everybody does things in their own timeline.
Yeah, it seems like something you can work on, but essentially it can just kind of be how your brain is wired a little bit. And even if you have all the time and space you need, which is a whole other consideration, like your book might not be its truest self unless you take that time that your imagination needs to work. And of course, like I wish that I wish that I had been born naturally with a brain that could write a book in like 2 months. But I also wish that I had been born with a brain that only needed like 5 hours of sleep each night and could operate perfectly. But I don't really have that either. So I'm
Huh.
just trying to work with like, work with what I have.
I wish I was born with a brain that I could use telekinesis to pick things up, because
Yeah.
that would make life so much easier. But
Yeah.
that's part of sci-fi, which brings me to, I guess, my last point that I wanted to make, or thing to chat with you about. Have you always been a big sci-fi person?
I haven't always been a huge sci-fi fan. I feel like my love of genre had to develop a little more slowly. As a kid, I actually did read very, very widely. I mean, I love like Wrinkle in Time. I feel like I would just, roam through the library and pick up whatever interested me. Like I said, I was homeschooled, so the library was like a place that I went all the time with my mom. And I have like such wonderful memories of my different childhood branches that I went to, and just that wonderful wealth of like being a kid and just like grabbing whatever sounds interesting, whatever cover seems exciting, and coming home with the book. And I did read very widely. Um, and then as I transitioned, like by my early 20s, I think that when I started my MFA program, I had become a little weirder about genre. And I don't think that this was something my MFA program passed on to me. Like, I'm not saying it was anyone else's fault. It was very much like my own weird insecurities about what I thought I should be writing, and what I thought was like real literature, or taking, or what I should be taking seriously.
Yeah, there's so much, I think, bias against genre fiction,
Yeah.
which is not really fair,
Oh
especially
no.
I think of people who are from our generation, because I think there was a lot of love for it. When you
Yeah.
like you have, like you mentioned, A Wrinkle in Time. I've been talking about, because it's very formidable for my youth, and I just had to research it. But The Neverending Story was really
Yes.
impactful.
Oh
And
yeah.
we grew up with Henson, we grew up with Spielberg, we
Mhm.
grew up with Lucas, and
Yeah.
all sorts of genre was all around us. And I feel like there's some pushback on that now. And that's not to discredit literary fiction, but I feel like we need to credit genre fiction as being valid and just as important, because it is.
Oh yeah. I mean, and the funny thing is, when I let myself relax a little more about genre and read whatever I wanted, it was so inspiring to me. And I feel like that's when I came to writing a little more seriously. Um, Even like the thriller genre, I just started, I feel like I picked up Gone Girl, and I was just like, like on the sentence level, I think this book like has like really punchy, vivid, beautiful sentences. And if you took them and transplanted them into like something labeled literary fiction, people would really appreciate them. But sometimes when people see a genre label, they go in with a less generous view. And I mean, I feel very lucky to be reading at a time where maybe we're relaxing that a little bit more, and we are seeing genre fiction as very important again. I think sometimes we can act as if we need to like elevate genre fiction, which I don't really love, because I'm like, it's already amazing though. You don't need to. I mean, it's fun to blend genres. Yeah.
Exactly. It's almost, I understand why people are doing it, because of the bias against it. But then at the same time, it's like, why was there a bias to begin with? It already was amazing.
Yeah. And I think it can be really fun to blend genres together, but not because the genres involved need to be made like more highbrow or more serious, just because it's fun. There are different conventions and different tropes in different genres. And when you pull a few from here and a few from there and like put them into a book together and see what kind of reactions happen, I think that can be really exciting. So I have a sense that we're taking genre blending and we're taking genre fiction more seriously now, or just letting ourselves enjoy like how amazing it is, because I think that for me, reading has always been such a pure source of like joy. So I think just reading a book because you just love it and truly enjoy it is one of the biggest gifts an author can give a reader. So I hope that we're not only taking it seriously, but also just letting ourselves have fun with it too.
Excellent. This was amazing. I think Girl One is going to be a very big hit. It's like right up there with some of my favorites. And
that's amazing.
So Girl One, it's available at your library and at your bookshop. I'd love to say it's available at your corner Walden Books, but that's the 90s. The 90s speaking, because there is no Walden Books anymore. But yeah. All right. Well, once again, this was wonderful. This is Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Our guest today was
Sara Flannery Murphy, and thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you. We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.